Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast today, How the SEC Cybersecurity Rule Impacts Your Organization. My name is Holly Spiers, and I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing for CyberGRX and ProcessUnity, and I will be your moderator today. I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers that we have. First, Bob Zukis. Bob is the founder and CEO of Digital Directors Network, the only network focused exclusively on systemic risk and digital and cybersecurity risk oversight in the corporate boardroom. Bob is regarded as one of the world's leading advocate, educator, and advisor on issues pertaining to C-suite executives and the corporate boardroom. He's taught CIOs and CISOs from some of the country's most prominent brands, including United Airlines, Kraft, Amazon, Pfizer, Sempra Energy, and many more. Bob is also a retired PwC advisory partner, where he led PwC's IT strategy and operations practice. Welcome, Bob.
Yeah, hi, Holly. Hey, Dave. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Yeah. And also with us today is Dave Stapleton, who is a cybersecurity risk professional with over a decade of experience in both the public and private sectors. He began his cyber career at the Department of Health and Human Services, where he developed and managed risk and compliance teams and led government-wide cloud security initiatives on behalf of the executive branch. Dave is currently the Chief Information Security Officer at CyberGRX and ProcessUnity, where he focuses on the implementation and efficacy of internal cybersecurity and privacy programs, as well as market-facing brand ambassadorship. Dave is also a certified information systems security professional. And Dave is no stranger to our webcasts. We've had him on several times. We're delighted that you're joining us again, Dave.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump in. The new SEC rule, which was adopted in July of this year, requires publicly traded organizations to disclose any cybersecurity incident they determine to be material and describe the material aspects of the incident, including the nature, scope, and timing. Additionally, incidents must be reported within 4 business days after the organization determines the incident to be material. With the new rule requirements, the SEC seeks to provide investors more transparency about the security posture of the companies they are investing in and how they are managing cyber risks. The new rule appears to be more demanding and extensive than previous rules. So my first question for you, Bob, are what are the major points of the rule that our listeners should be aware of?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. And it's you hit the big one. It's materiality. There's been some misinformation about the interpretation of what that means. We're going to talk about materiality here in a moment, but just for clarity, issuers now have the responsibility to determine materiality, and then the 4-day trigger kicks in once they make that determination. So think of MGM right now. So MGM, have they determined that this is material? I think many of us would probably say it obviously looks pretty material. So the 4-day trigger is now running for them. And if the rules weren't in place right now, they would have until Friday to make that disclosure. So there's actually less urgency on issuers now because the materiality determination is under their control. But the challenge is, what does materiality mean? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. The other big change is it introduces systemic risk into the conversation for the first time. So the SEC wants disclosure on risk and incidents of third-party service providers. I found really curious one part of their disclosures requirements as well, where they want issuers to now disclose how much of the cybersecurity processes are insourced versus outsourced. That's a very curious disclosure that I think is going to force some management teams to rethink how they manage cybersecurity. And that kind of stood out to me. They've added some disclosures for governance. They generally went light on the boardroom's responsibilities to this issue, but boardroom structure. So is it an audit committee? Is it a cyber committee, a tech and a cyber committee? The board's role in cybersecurity oversight, the processes of board communication. So there will be a higher level of transparency to what the boardroom is doing around these issues. But I think it's really a materiality, third-party risk, that funky little disclosure around insourced versus outsourced, and really the board's approach to these issues, and then management's processes. They really want management to really focus on the maturity and the disclosure and the transparency of their processes around this issue.
Great. Do you think the new rule will have a positive impact and accomplish a meaningful objective?
I think it's a game changer in some respects and a missed opportunity in others. The missed opportunity was strengthening the board's role in the cybersecurity system, which they could have easily done by leaving in the does anybody on the board have cyber expertise disclosure provision, but frankly, the boardroom community freaked out about that. So it didn't make the final cut. I think materiality is a game changer. Systemic risk is a game changer. So the materiality issue is going to force CEOs, CFOs, disclosure committees, boards, a broader collection of executives to understand exactly how the information system creates value for the business directly and indirectly, because you're going to have to go through that discussion and that analysis to get to that materiality determination. Should we disclose it or not? So that's what the SEC likes to do a lot of times, put it on the issuer to figure stuff out. They want a deliberative process and critical thinking applied to these issues. So I think it's going to bring a lot of that forward and mature how companies understand the information system and its relationship to the business and the business's value proposition.
Great, thank you. Dave, what do you think? Is the rule a step in the right direction towards a more secure future?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think this administration's been fairly outspoken about their desire to significantly improve the nation's security posture. And I think these new macro government policies and overall governance, like this one, are part of that overall strategic plan. So that is the intent, certainly. Also, generally speaking, I think that setting clear expectations and providing that accountability will improve outcomes. And this rule does that, I think, in many ways that we'll get into. I think we'll probably talk a little later, as Bob said, about how clear or maybe unclear for some audiences some of the rule is. But publicly traded companies undoubtedly are very much on notice that they have an incident reporting requirement. They have a requirement for narratively and accurately describing their risk management programs. So I think some of that expectation and accountability has been set, and that's always going to, I think, produce some positive outcomes. I also suspect that if nothing else, the tactical steps that are necessary to prepare for these requirements will improve the security posture of some organizations at the very least. For example, for many organizations, just the process of examining step by step how a potential incident is identified and then verified, how it's measured against this definition of materiality and then communicated appropriately. That alone, those steps, the tactical pieces, are going to uncover gaps in their existing processes. And then you have an opportunity to know what you need to improve and then take steps to make those improvements. So yeah, I'm an optimist, but I think that this is most definitely a step in the right direction.
We've both alluded to some of these terms that are not clearly defined. So let's jump in there. Let's talk about the ambiguities of the language, specifically materiality and incident being two that, immediately pop out that have spurred conversation. Do organizations define these terms themselves, or do you foresee definitions coming from the government? And Bob, I'm going to go to you first on this. How are you advising organizations around these terms?
Don't look for anything from the government. That's not how they approach this concept of materiality. And that's an eye of the beholder test under SEC rules and the court decisions that have kind of indoctrinated that into, disclosure and what it means in terms of protecting investor interests. And that's ultimately what this is about, right? And so what happens is, issuers, don't like to be dictated whether there's a hard threshold or a hard determination for whether something forces them to do something. But then they also don't like to have to be forced to think about an issue and figure it out for themselves. So they try to have it both ways. But this is very much the SEC saying it's an objective measure. And the measure is determined based upon court precedent. And it's really that eye of the beholder test. Would this information, would this incident have been deemed material in the eyes of a reasonable investor in that investor making their investment decision? And so if that's a yes, then you disclose. If that's a no, then you continue to monitor, gather more information, because you're allowed to do that now. And once you figure it out, make that subjective determination of whether it's material or not, then you disclose. So they've left it up to the issuer. And I think that's the right answer, because they're forcing the issue to critically think about this now. And, it's not an accountant's view of 5% of revenue, 2% of profitability. There's quantitative and qualitative elements here. So if you have an incident and it causes a loss of life, would a reasonable investor have considered that information material in making their investment decision, to know that your company and your information systems can kill people? MGM, Toyota had an incident a couple of weeks ago that wasn't the result of a malicious act. It was a result of an error, a problem that they had within their information system. And so it shut down their 14 manufacturing facilities. Wouldn't a reasonable investor consider the information that your information system could fail and shut down all your manufacturing useful information in making their investment decision? And so that kind of thought process is going to have to be baked in and thought through in an entirely new, different kind of context to apply that materiality threshold. I think it's good, very good development.
Right. What about third-party incidents? I mean, what are the implications and reporting requirements in relation to those?
Talk about a can of worms. It introduces systemic risk to the enterprise risk discussion really for the first time. It's been something we've been beating the drum on for 6 years at DDN, but now it's like incident and risk. So the extended third-party ecosystem that most companies now depend upon. If an incident occurs in one of those third parties, you have to understand, and then if the incident has to be communicated to you, you've got to interpret that in the context of materiality in your environment and for your investors. And the SEC contemplates that could create a duplicate reporting. So the third party could report it, you could report it, the 100,000 people that are impacted by that incident. If it's a major outage in a major service provider that impacts tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users of that service, could all be reporting it. So think about what kind of chaos that could create. And I think it creates a new burden on the tech firms that have introduced that level of systemic risk to their customers in the markets.
Dave, your reaction to Bob's comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, real quick on that one, I don't envy the people at the SEC who are receiving a lot of this information and trying to parse and attribute and correlate. That's going to be a task for sure. But going back to the materiality bit, I think the conversation about how to accurately define materiality is probably going to go on for ages. There's, Bob described it with a lot of subject matter expertise and a very clear way. But then as soon as you get into that conversation, you're like, okay, so how are we going to do it? It starts to get a little bit more murky, especially for folks who maybe haven't had a lot of experience with that. To me, maybe the most difficult part of the definition is that trying to understand or predict what a reasonable investor would consider to be important. Some are very obvious, loss of human life. I think that's 100% of the time going to be material. But this is an area where I think CISOs will want to contribute to the conversation as needed, but rely really heavily on their business counterparts to clarify the investor point of view. That's not necessarily an area where like the CISO is going to have, I think, the best background knowledge and expertise. But I think the most important thing there is develop an agreed upon framework for how to evaluate the specifics of an incident and then determine that materiality when the time comes. So there's still like a real partnership, I think, between the security leadership in an organization and some of the more business-minded leadership as well. With regard to the third-party reporting piece of it, I'm always happy when I see institutions and policymakers acknowledging the importance of including third parties in our understanding and our management of risk. My hope is that this will be one piece of the reporting requirement that will be kind of a forcing function that will significantly improve the way organizations manage third-party risk overall. If you think about this, in order to report an incident related to a third party or a fourth party, since we're talking systemic, an organization will first have to be aware of that incident. In order to do that, that requires establishing some kind of notification expectations with those third parties at the very least, or more likely in some cases requires some form of third-party risk monitoring to be in place. In order for that monitoring to be effective, organizations will have to establish an understanding of what risks within a third party would be most likely to result in an impactful incident. So, as I'm describing that, hopefully you can see there's kind of almost a cascading effect that starts with just this. You have to report these incidents related to your third parties. But in order to do that, kind of like I was saying in the beginning, those tactical steps of figuring out how to accomplish that, I think will require a real uplift, hopefully across the board for a lot of organizations in regard to their broad third-party risk management program. And that, I assume, was very much by design when this was being written.
A lot of consideration for the CISO to have to take in actually implementing this. And
yeah, Holly, if I could add a comment there,
Yeah.
Dave said, CISOs will be forced to contribute to that discussion. I think they'll be forced to lead that discussion. They can't just talk about threats and controls. They've got to actually now interpret that incident in the context of the business and the context, and then come to a conclusion of whether they think a reasonable investor would find it material or not. So they're going to have to come up with that heuristic to go through that analysis. And the leadership team, the disclosure committee, the CEO, the CFO are going to expect them to take it to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
Which really, I mean, it kind of leads to this concept of, CISO liability in this. So Proofpoint's 2023 Voice of the CISO report found that 62% of CISOs are concerned about personal liability in their role. And that's, before this rule was implemented. Do you think the rule will add to those concerns, or what do you think the impact will be on the way that they approach their role? And I'll start with you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, my hope is that the rule will, as much as Bob just said, elevate the role of the CISO in the minds of organizations they work in. CISOs will be critical to sufficiently complying with these requirements. It's just, there's no way around that. They already speak this language of cyber risk and incident response and security program development, and that are all required by this rule. So that is my hope, that we'll see the elevation of that role in some ways. But that said, recent news regarding CISOs that have become quite widespread, like Joe Sullivan, have sparked a pretty intense conversation in the CISO community about, like you said, personal liability. Obviously, step one in avoiding that liability is to not withhold information from federal investigators during or after a cyber incident. But I think that speaks directly to the concerns about this, SEC cybersecurity rule. What if there's a disagreement about how to define materiality, resulting in underreporting of an incident? Going to be held accountable in those situations. What if the security program at an organization just simply didn't identify or properly evaluate and measure an incident, putting the company at odds with the requirements of the rule? So who's to blame in those situations? So I think that's the kind of thing that's on the minds of CISOs, as they've gotten a few examples that, oh wow, if things don't go correctly, if I don't handle this in a proper way, I could personally be held liable. I think some of those types of fears may be unfounded. Could be a little bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt creeping in, which has a tendency to happen from time to time. But I think all CISOs, certainly at publicly traded companies, are going to be paying very close attention.
And I know, Bob, you said, that perhaps the rule didn't go quite as far as people were hoping on the board's accountability in this. But do you think the rule overall will strengthen the board's perspective or the governance of cybersecurity?
Yes, I do. And just to echo what Dave said, I think but it put the CISO in the hot seat. I got a new barbecue grill this weekend. It's got a sear station on it, so it's got that knob that goes nuclear and puts those nice grill marks on the steak and the hamburger. Right, the SEC just turned that thing on, and the CISOs are sitting on top of it. So much more accountability for management teams and the CISOs than for the board themselves with the new rules.
Gotcha. So Dave, given that you're in the hot seat even more now, do you think that the CISO role will actually get the visibility, get that well-deserved seat at the C-suite table now?
I got to say, I hope so, but I'm a little cynical. My guess is it's not going to happen immediately. We may need a couple of examples, unfortunately, to be made. Organizations have been consistently pretty stubborn on this issue, often kind of speaking, from my opinion, out of both sides of their mouth, saying, the security of our customers' data is our number one priority, and simultaneously saying, well, no, but the CISO doesn't really belong on the C-suite, nor maybe should they have that much interaction with the board other than maybe a couple of 5-minute presentations, 1 or 2 times a year. So my cynical side wonders if it will take a couple of disciplinary actions by the SEC to prove that they're real serious about this, and before companies will really realize that now there is a need for a change in the CISO role. And I think it's also important to point out, while I'm saying all this, that CISOs are not asking to be the head honcho. What they want is to be able to contribute on an equal footing with other executives to maximize value for the organization and its stakeholders. With regard to this SEC rule, I think companies will find that CISOs can play in a really important role in that partnership with other leaders in ensuring that they're adequately prepared, and able to execute in compliance with the requirements when the time comes. So it is absolutely my hope that this will elevate CISOs, and they will have an opportunity to get a seat at the table. And I think it will happen eventually. The question in my mind is, I wonder how long it will take, and how many are going to suffer maybe some negative consequences in the meantime.
Yeah, Holly, and I would say it's a leadership moment. They're going to have to step up. Some will, some won't. But this is a fantastic moment to recast the role into a much more impactful light within the organization and amongst the C-suite and amongst the boardroom. And so seize the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see the CISO being part of the board meetings? I know that, you folks at DDN specialize in that. Bob, do you think that's going to be the first step, is, well, we got to get these guys in the room at least to talk to us?
Yeah, and many of them have been in the room before. Half of our members, we surveyed our members, and half of them have already said that they're actually meeting in executive sessions with the board. So one-on-one sessions with the board without the other management teams there. I didn't expect the number to be half. But we're our members are self-selecting into they're the leaders on these issues. They're the ones that are transforming the board, transforming the role already. So maybe you'd already expect that. There's probably a little bit of a bias in our membership base, but yeah, that's what's going to happen. And that disclosure committee, you may want to be on that disclosure committee. You may want to ask to be on that disclosure committee. You're certainly going to be pulled into the disclosure committee meetings a heck of a lot more than you have been before, and you're going to be interacting with executives at a much different level than you have been before. So step up and step into it. I like it. I like stuff like this.
Hey, Bob, one clarification or I guess question for you. Do you think the requirements will extend beyond public organizations at any point?
Usually what happens, there is a trickle down effect. If the SEC rules are prescriptive, these aren't that prescriptive. So the policy guidance isn't, put this committee structure in place, put a financial expert on your board like they did with Sarbanes-Oxley. We saw that cascade with Sarbanes-Oxley. This is much more on each individual issuer. So it didn't indoctrinate a collection of practices as standard practices. So I think the trickle is going to be much slower. I would say, though, that the leading practices that are out there are already well beyond where the SEC has landed on these issues. So there are companies like FedEx, GM, companies in Nigeria, companies in Malaysia that we've identified that have adopted differential leading practices at the board level. But the fact is they're too fragmented, right? So most people don't have transparency or visibility into it. So it'll trickle. It's going to be a very slow trickle, though. But pay attention to the leading practices, not where the SEC landed here, because the SEC and regulators lag market relevance always by definition. So they're not the leading edge, far from it.
And the rule includes a requirement about organizations disclosing information about their risk management programs. I'm just curious, Bob, what key elements do you think should be included in that disclosure, or how would you advise people in disclosing?
The SEC changed the language here. So they didn't want specific policies and procedures. They wanted processes. They changed in the final rules this to processes. So it's a higher level narrative of what you're doing. You don't have to get into the actual policies and procedures, which issuers felt would be too descriptive and give malicious actors a roadmap to vulnerabilities. So yeah, you're going to have to tell a story for how you approach this from beginning to end. And I think that's going to be good because it's going to create critical thinking, and you're going to have to look at it from beginning to end and then put that into the narrative of here's how our processes work from a cybersecurity management perspective, from threat to incident materiality. Yeah, threat, it goes to the system, right? Data, information architecture, risk comms, emerging tech, the parts of the system, and then all the quantitative and qualitative value drivers that the business has in place: financial impact, revenue, profitability, balance sheet, assets, market value, customer convenience, customer choice, employee productivity, all the indirect stuff, the stakeholders that it implicates, and then the incident and whether it's material or not. What's that process look like for your approach to this issue?
Any gotchas that you think organizations should be aware of so far with the rule and the way it's written?
The one I like is that curious one of, how much of the insourced versus outsourced. That's a bit of a gotcha. That's kind of an interesting, curious inclusion that I really stood out to me. And how will investors react to that if you're basically you have no internal skills capabilities on this issue and you outsource it all? And I found that really interesting that was a part of the final disclosure rules, and they thought that would be something that investors would find useful information.
Dave, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one's also probably the most interesting kind of a gotcha. The other thing I just mentioned, and I kind of alluded to it before, is this idea that CISOs maybe being a little bit concerned about where does the accountability and the liability lie within an organization, and how do they fit? Maybe they haven't had those opportunities to have those discussions before, may want to adopt a more broad definition of incident or materiality in order to just make sure they're being careful to maybe in some cases almost over report. Conversely, I think the business is going to take a more conservative approach to avoid any unnecessary disclosure and negative impact on the business. So there's a potential for somewhat of a conflict of interest there that just needs to be worked out in advance. So not so much a gotcha, as so much as it is potentially a challenge, I think, that may not be immediately apparent when you read the rule.
Okay. Well, sort of with that note, I'd love to understand, a couple of tips from each of you of what organizations should be doing now to prepare. And maybe as part of your answer, Dave, I'd love to understand what CISOs themselves can be doing to build skills that they will need to participate differently in these conversations.
Yep. Well, just in the interest of time, I'll say the biggest thing in my mind is if you haven't started to prepare already, start. That's maybe the number one thing as far as preparation for organizations. This is here now, and don't delay. For CISOs, I think, for the past 10 years or so, the role of the CISO has really been evolving, and it's becoming more of a business leadership type of a role. CISOs, to Bob's point, need to lean into that. This is an opportunity. We keep saying, hey, we want to see it at the table. Well, here we go. And so I think one of the big things is to pay attention, establish and identify business-related mentors who can help you understand that language of business and the flow of it, so that you can have that ability to communicate clearly in these situations and be there and show up. You've got this opportunity. Now's the time to show up. So I think that's the biggest thing, is just understand how the business is really working, and don't get caught in your cybersecurity metrics and the things that feel familiar.
Great. Bob, your final thoughts?
Yeah, reach out to the disclosure committee. You may have a charter for that committee. Who's on it? What is the charter? What are the responsibilities? How do they do their work? Don't wait for them to contact you, because they will be, but reach out and figure that out. And the second thing is you're going to have to build that heuristic. You're going to have build that thought process to go from incident through its impact to the system, its impact quantitatively and qualitatively, which stakeholders are impacted, and then come up to a conclusion of whether you actually think an incident translates into a material issue or not. That disclosure committee, the CEO, the CFO have ultimate responsibility for that. And the board, they're going to ask you, do you think this incident is material or not under the context of the new SEC rules? You can't just say, well, I don't know. The expectation is you're going to have to come to make a recommendation to that effect. So you're going to have to build that analysis, that decision matrix to make that determination. And that's what the SEC wants you to do. They want this to be a deliberative process. And so that's your starting point, disclosure committee starting point. And then the next big hurdle is the third-party risk stuff. What does that process look like currently, and how do you need to change that and augment that to be able to report those incidents or understand those risks?
Great. Well, Bob and Dave, thank you so much. Bob, do you have a moment to give the audience a little bit of education around the Digital Directors Network and what you have coming up that may be of interest?
Very sure. We're building the practice and profession. I've been doing this for the last 6 years. It's all we do, the practice and profession of digital and cybersecurity risk oversight. So world-class group of CIOs, CISOs, corporate directors from America's leading companies. We're a learning network trying to advance these issues. November 9th, our next masterclass in Chicago at the University of Chicago. You'll see it on the website, digitaldirectors.network, and get engaged. Our membership is a curated membership. We don't charge dues. So if you want to learn about this stuff, we're the ones figuring it out.
Great. For the audience, we will have an exit survey and an opportunity to check a box if you'd like to learn more about the DDN, as well as more about CyberGRX and our portfolio risk findings, which can help you start finding the risk within your third-party ecosystem. With that, I just want to thank you both for joining us today and really breaking down this topic, which I know is of interest to a lot of folks. So thank you and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, guys. See you, everybody.
Much. Bye-bye.